The gravel crunched beneath my worn black shoes as I stepped out of the rental car, the sound unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. St. Mary's Catholic Church stood before me like a weathered sentinel, its red brick facade and modest white steeple unchanged from my childhood memories. 7 days. It had been exactly 7 days since we laid Mom to rest in the cemetery behind this very building, and here I was again, drawn back by tradition, and a desperate need for closure that seemed to slip further away with each passing hour. The morning air carried the scent of late autumn, dying leaves and the faint smell of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. October in rural Pennsylvania had always been Mom's favorite time of year. She used to say the world was putting on its finest dress before winter came to claim it. I pulled my black coat tighter around my shoulders and walked toward the heavy wooden doors, each step feeling heavier than the last. Inside, the familiar smell of incense and old wood embraced me like an unwanted hug. The church was smaller than I remembered from my youth, or perhaps grief had a way of shrinking everything around it. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the worn pews where a modest gathering of mourners had already assembled. I recognized most of the faces: neighbors who had known Mom for decades, members of her book club, fellow volunteers from the food bank where she spent countless hours even into her 70s. Mrs. Henderson, our next-door neighbor for over 30 years, caught my eye and offered a sad smile. Her weathered hands clutched a tissue, and I could see she'd been crying. Mom had always been there for her, bringing soup when she was sick, helping with her garden, listening to her stories about her late husband. Now Mrs. Henderson sat alone in the third pew, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. I chose a seat in the front row, where family was expected to sit. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the only family left. No siblings to share this burden. No father who had been gone for over a decade. No children of my own to carry forward the memories that now resided solely in my increasingly unreliable mind. At 42, I had become the final repository of our family history, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Father Mackenzie emerged from the sacristy, his silver hair catching the morning light. He had been Mom's priest for 15 years, ever since Father O'Brien retired. Mom had initially been skeptical of the younger replacement, but Father Mackenzie's gentle manner and genuine care for his congregation had won her over. During her final weeks in the hospital, he had visited regularly, not just as a priest fulfilling his duties, but as a friend who genuinely cared about her spiritual journey toward whatever waited beyond. "Good morning," he said softly, approaching me before the service began. His eyes held the kind of compassion that came from years of shepherding people through life's most difficult moments. "How are you holding up, Michael?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The truth was, I wasn't holding up at all. The past week had been a blur of funeral arrangements, legal paperwork, and the overwhelming task of beginning to sort through a lifetime of accumulated memories. Mom's house still smelled like her perfume and the lavender sachets she kept in every drawer. Her coffee cup still sat in the sink where she'd left it on that final morning before the ambulance came. I hadn't had the heart to wash it yet. "She was very proud of you," Father Mackenzie continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "She talked about you constantly, your job in the city, your travels, your accomplishments. But more than that, she talked about the man you'd become, your kindness, your integrity. Those are the things that mattered most to her." I felt my throat tighten. Mom had never been one for elaborate emotional displays, but somehow she'd managed to convey her pride in subtle ways. A newspaper clipping about my promotion tucked into a birthday card. A phone call just to hear about my day, the way her eyes lit up whenever I walked through her front door. The service began with the familiar ritual of standing and sitting, responding to prayers I'd memorized decades ago, but had rarely spoken in recent years. My faith had become complicated over the years. Not lost exactly, but buried under layers of adult cynicism and the relentless pace of city life. Yet here, surrounded by the rhythms of childhood worship, something in my chest loosened slightly. I found my mind wandering as Father Mackenzie spoke about Mom's life. He talked about her marriage to Dad, their struggles during his illness. Her strength in raising me as essentially a single mother after his first stroke left him diminished. He spoke of her volunteer work, her love of books, her legendary apple pie that had won the county fair 3 years running. But there were so many stories he didn't know, couldn't know, like how she used to sing while folding laundry, old hymns mixed with show tunes in a voice that was never quite on key but always full of joy, how she saved every card I'd ever sent her, keeping them in a shoebox under her bed, how she'd call me at work sometimes, just to tell me about a particularly beautiful sunset, or to share a joke she'd heard at the grocery store. I remembered the last real conversation we'd had, just 3 weeks before the heart attack took her. We were sitting on her back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She'd made iced tea and brought out a plate of cookies, and we talked about everything and nothing. My job, her garden, a book she was reading about World War II. At some point she grew quiet and reached over to pat my hand. "You know I'm proud of you, don't you?" she'd said out of nowhere. "Mom, where's this coming from?" I'd laughed, uncomfortable with the sudden seriousness in her tone. "I just want to make sure you know. Sometimes I worry I didn't say it enough when you were growing up. Your father and I, we were raised to believe that love was shown through actions, not words. But maybe we should have said the words more often. You showed me every day," I'd told her, and meant it. "You didn't need to say it." She'd smiled then, that soft smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "Good. That's good. Just promise me something. Don't spend your whole life working. Find someone to share it with. Make a family. These old walls will be here long after I'm gone, but they're just wood and brick without people to fill them with laughter." I'd promised, though we both knew it was the kind of promise that's easier made than kept. At 42, I'd had relationships, but never marriage, career success, but never the deep satisfaction that comes from building something lasting with another person. Now, sitting in this church, I wondered if I'd spent so much time building a life that I'd forgotten to actually live one. The congregation rose for the gospel reading, and I stood with them, my legs stiff from sitting in the uncomfortable wooden pew. Around me, voices joined in the familiar responses, creating a chorus of faith that had sustained this small community for generations. I recognized many of the voices. Mrs. Patterson from the post office, whose soprano still carried true despite her 80-plus years. Tom Brennan, who ran the hardware store and whose bass voice anchored the church choir. The Miller family, whose children had grown up alongside me and now brought their own children to these same pews. This was Mom's community, the network of relationships she'd nurtured over decades of shared joys and sorrows. They'd rallied around her during Dad's illness, bringing casseroles and offering rides to doctor appointments. They'd celebrated with her when I graduated college, commissioned as an officer in the Army, got my first real job in Philadelphia, and they'd grieved with her during the lonely years after Dad died, making sure she was never truly alone, even when I was too busy with my own life to visit as often as I should have. Now they were here for her one final time, and for me, the prodigal son who'd returned not in triumph, but in sorrow. I could feel their sympathy reaching across the space between us, a collective embrace from people who understood that grief was not a burden to be carried alone. Father Mackenzie moved to the pulpit for his homily, his hands resting lightly on the worn wood. Today, we gather not just to mourn the loss of Margaret Sullivan, but to celebrate a life well lived, and to pray for her soul's journey to eternal rest. Margaret was many things to many people: mother, neighbor, friend, volunteer. But above all, she was a woman of faith who found God not just in these sacred walls, but in the daily acts of love and service that defined her life. He paused, his eyes finding mine. She once told me that she measured her days not by what she accomplished for herself, but by how many people she could help along the way. It's a simple philosophy, but one that made her a beacon of light in our community. As he continued speaking, I felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill over. The weight of loss seemed to intensify in this sacred space, surrounded by reminders of Mom's faith and the community that had sustained her. I thought about the empty house waiting for me after the service, the decisions I'd been avoiding about what to do with her belongings, the life I'd built in Philadelphia that suddenly seemed hollow and incomplete. The service moved toward its conclusion with the familiar rhythms of the Catholic Mass. Soon, Father Mackenzie would speak the final blessing, and this formal goodbye would be complete. I wasn't ready for it to end. Once I walked out of this church, once I drove back to the city, the reality of Mom's absence would settle in completely. There would be no more phone calls, no more visits, no more chances to say the things I should have said while she was alive to hear them. As if sensing the approaching end, the congregation grew quieter, more reverent. The morning light had shifted, casting new patterns through the stained glass windows. I closed my eyes and tried to feel Mom's presence, tried to believe that somewhere beyond the veil of death, she was at peace, and free from the arthritis pain that had plagued her final years. Father Mackenzie approached the altar for the final blessing, his voice carrying clearly through the small sanctuary. The moment felt suspended in time, heavy with significance and the collective prayers of everyone gathered in that sacred space. I opened my eyes and looked around one final time at the faces of people who had known and loved my mother, storing their presence in my memory alongside all the other pieces of this day I would carry forward. The priest raised his hands, and in that moment, everything felt balanced on the edge of something profound, an ending, a beginning, or perhaps something else entirely. Father Mackenzie's voice carried through the sanctuary with the practiced cadence of countless Sunday mornings and solemn occasions. His words seemed to float in the amber light filtering through the stained glass, each syllable weighted with the gravity of final farewell. I watched his weathered hands move in the familiar gestures of blessing, the same movements that had comforted generations of parishioners through their darkest hours. "Eternal rest grant unto her, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon her," he intoned, his voice growing stronger as he approached the climactic moment of the memorial service. The congregation responded in unison, their voices creating a chorus that seemed to lift toward the vaulted ceiling of the small church. I found myself mouthing the words without conscious thought, muscle memory from countless childhood Sundays when Mom would nudge me to participate more fully in the responses. Even then, I'd been more observer than participant, watching the theater of faith unfold around me while struggling with my own complicated relationship with belief. Now, at 42, I still carried that same uncertainty, that same longing to feel the certainty that seemed to come so naturally to others. The morning light had shifted as the service progressed, and now long shadows stretched across the worn wooden pews. I could smell the lingering traces of incense mixed with the musty scent of old hymnals and the faint perfume that Mrs. Henderson always wore to church. Everything felt hyper-real, as if my grief had sharpened my senses to an almost painful degree of clarity. Father Mackenzie lifted his hands for the final blessing, his silver hair catching the light from the windows behind him. "May Almighty God bless you, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit," he began, his voice taking on the resonant quality reserved for the most sacred moments of the liturgy. It was in that instant, as the word Spirit left his lips, that the world changed. The sound came first, a sharp, electrical snap that seemed to originate from everywhere at once. Then, in the space of a single heartbeat, every light in the church went dark. Not the gradual dimming of a power outage or the flickering that precedes electrical failure, but an instantaneous, complete extinction of every bulb simultaneously. The overhead fixtures, the reading lamps beside the altar, even the small bulb that illuminated the exit sign, all died together as if controlled by some invisible master switch. The transformation was so sudden and complete that for a moment, no one moved. The congregation sat frozen in the absolute darkness, the only light coming from the stained glass windows that now seemed to glow with an otherworldly intensity against the blackness of the church interior. The colored glass cast strange patterns across the walls and ceiling, creating an atmosphere that felt both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Then came the sounds, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind me, the creak of wooden pews as people shifted nervously, the rustle of clothing as heads turned to look around in confusion. Someone's purse fell to the floor with a soft thud, and I heard the distinctive sound of rosary beads clicking together as nervous fingers sought comfort in familiar objects. "Jesus Christ," whispered a voice from the back of the church, the words carrying clearly in the profound silence that had fallen over the gathering. I couldn't tell if it was an expression of shock or an actual prayer. My own heart was racing, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead despite the mild autumn temperature. There was something profoundly wrong about what had just happened, something that went beyond a simple electrical malfunction. The timing was too perfect, too precisely synchronized with Father Mackenzie's final blessing, and the way all the lights had died together, not gradually, not randomly, but as one coordinated event, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Father Mackenzie's voice cut through the darkness, steady and reassuring. "Please remain calm, everyone. There's obviously been some kind of electrical problem. Let me find the emergency candles." I heard his footsteps moving carefully across the altar area, the sound of his shoes on the marble steps unnaturally loud in the silence. There was a scraping sound as he felt around in the darkness, probably looking for the drawer where the church kept candles for occasions like this. Though I wondered how many occasions quite like this there had ever been. Behind me, Mrs. Patterson's voice quavered as she spoke to whoever was sitting next to her. "In all my 83 years coming to this church, I've never seen anything like that. The lights don't all go out at once like that. Not unless—" She trailed off, leaving her thought unfinished, but I could guess what she was thinking. Not unless something beyond the natural world had intervened. "It's just a power surge," came another voice, male and skeptical. I recognized it as belonging to Dr. Phillips, who ran the medical clinic in town. Old wiring in these buildings can be unpredictable, probably blew a main fuse or something. But even as he spoke, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We all knew that the church had been rewired just 5 years ago as part of a major renovation project that Mom had helped organize. She'd been on the building committee, spending countless hours coordinating with contractors and ensuring every detail was perfect. The electrical work had been done by professionals and inspected multiple times. This wasn't the result of old wiring. The sound of a match being struck pierced the darkness, and suddenly Father Mackenzie's face appeared in the warm glow of candlelight. He looked pale, but composed as he lit a larger candle from the small flame, then began moving around the altar area to illuminate more candles. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, transforming the familiar church into something that felt ancient and mysterious. "There we are," he said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that I'd never heard before. "That's better. Now, if everyone could please remain seated while I check the electrical panel." As more candles were lit, faces began to emerge from the darkness like figures in a Renaissance painting. I turned to look back at the congregation and was struck by the expressions I saw. Not just confusion or concern, but something deeper. Fear, perhaps. Or awe. The faces around me looked like they were witnessing something sacred and terrible. Something that defied easy explanation. Mrs. Henderson had pulled out her own rosary and was fingering the beads quietly, her lips moving in silent prayer. The Miller family had drawn closer together in their pew, the parents instinctively protecting their children from whatever force had caused this disturbance. Even the teenagers who had been checking their phones and looking bored during the service now sat in rapt attention, their devices forgotten in their laps. "Mom," I whispered into the flickering candlelight, though I hadn't consciously intended to speak. The word seemed to slip out on its own, carrying with it a lifetime of conversations, arguments, reconciliations, and love. "Is that you?" The question hung in the air, and I immediately felt foolish for asking it. But there was something about the timing, the impossible coordination of the electrical failure, that made rational explanation seem inadequate. Mom had always been a woman who made her presence known, who didn't fade quietly into the background. If anyone would find a way to make their voice heard from beyond death, it would be her. Tom Brennan's deep voice rumbled from somewhere in the middle of the church. Margaret always did like to have the last word. There was nervous laughter from several people, but it quickly died away. Even attempts at humor felt somehow inappropriate in the face of what we'd just experienced. Father Mackenzie had found a flashlight somewhere and was making his way toward the back of the church, presumably to check the electrical panel. As he moved down the center aisle, the beam of his light swept across the faces of the congregation, and I could see that everyone was struggling to process what had happened. Some looked frightened, others appeared deeply moved, and a few seemed almost angry, as if this disruption of the natural order was a personal affront. "Father," called out Mrs. Patterson, her voice stronger now that some light had been restored. "In all your years of ministry, have you ever seen anything like this?" He paused in his journey toward the electrical panel, and I could see him considering his response carefully. Father Mackenzie was not a man given to supernatural explanations. He was practical, educated, someone who approached faith through reason as much as through mystery. But there was something in his expression, visible even in the uncertain candlelight, that suggested he was grappling with questions that went beyond electrical engineering. "I've seen many things in my years of service," he said finally, "some that challenged my understanding of how the world works. But I've learned that God speaks to us in many ways, and not all of them are easy to explain or understand." It wasn't exactly an answer, but it wasn't a dismissal either. He continued toward the back of the church, leaving us to sit with our own interpretations of what had occurred. The silence that settled over the congregation was different now, not the companionable quiet of shared worship, but the charged atmosphere of a group of people trying to make sense of an impossible experience. I could hear whispered conversations starting up around the church, fragments of speculation and uncertainty. "Never seen anything like it in 40 years of electrical work." Right when he said the blessing, "Margaret always did have a strong will. Coincidence has to be." I closed my eyes and tried to feel something, some presence or sign that would validate the growing certainty in my chest that this was more than random mechanical failure. The candlelight flickered behind my eyelids, creating patterns that seemed almost like movement, almost like a figure dancing at the edge of perception. Then, as suddenly as they had died, the lights came back on. The return of electricity was as instantaneous and coordinated as its departure had been. Every bulb, every fixture, every small illuminated detail blazed back to life in perfect unison, banishing the shadows and returning the church to its familiar daytime appearance. The transition was so abrupt that several people gasped, and I heard someone's prayer book fall to the floor in startlement. Father Mackenzie's flashlight beam looked pale and inadequate now against the restored artificial lighting. He stood frozen near the electrical panel, which he hadn't even reached yet, let alone opened. From where I sat, I could see his face clearly now, and the expression there was one of complete bewilderment. "I didn't touch anything," he called out to the congregation, his voice carrying a note of wonder that made him sound younger than his 60-some years. "I was still walking back there. I didn't even reach the panel." The implications of his words settled over the church like another kind of silence. If he hadn't restored the power, and if the electrical system had been functioning normally before and after the outage, then what had caused the lights to fail and return so precisely? What force had been powerful enough to control the electrical system of the entire building with such perfect timing? Dr. Phillips cleared his throat, clearly struggling to maintain his rationalist worldview in the face of evidence that seemed to defy rational explanation. "There must be some kind of automatic reset system. Modern electrical panels have all sorts of safety features that can cycle power if there's an overload or surge." But his explanation sounded weak even to his own ears. We all knew that automatic systems didn't work with the kind of dramatic timing we'd just witnessed. They didn't wait for the precise moment of a priest's blessing to activate, and they didn't restore power with such theatrical perfection. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, now clearly visible again in the restored light. The expressions I saw there ranged from wonder to fear to a kind of reverent awe. Whatever had just happened, it had affected everyone present in profound and personal ways. This wasn't just a story we would tell others. It was an experience that would change how each of us understood the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. The candles that Father Mackenzie had lit still flickered on the altar, their warm light now competing with the harsh fluorescence of the overhead fixtures. He moved to extinguish them, but then paused, as if reluctant to erase the last traces of those mysterious minutes when candlelight had been our only guide through the darkness. "Well," he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of wonder and uncertainty, "it seems that our memorial service has concluded in a rather memorable way." There were a few nervous chuckles from the congregation, but mostly people sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed. I remained in my front pew, unwilling to break the spell by standing and walking away. Something profound had just occurred, and I wasn't ready to return to the ordinary world where such things didn't happen. As I sat there, surrounded by the restored normalcy of electric light and the gradual return of everyday conversation. I felt a certainty growing in my chest that this had been more than coincidence, more than electrical malfunction. This had been a message, a sign, a final communication from someone who had always made sure her voice was heard. "Thanks, Mom," I whispered, so quietly that no one else could hear. I got the message. The congregation began to stir slowly, like sleepers awakening from a collective dream that had transported them far beyond the boundaries of ordinary Sunday morning experience. People rose from their pews with the cautious, deliberate movements of those who weren't entirely sure the world had returned to its familiar rhythms, their faces bearing expressions that ranged from wonder to bewilderment, to a kind of reverent fear that spoke to witnessing something that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. The harsh fluorescent lighting that now filled St. Mary's seemed almost aggressive after those mysterious minutes of candlelight and shadow, creating stark contrasts where before there had been gentle, dancing illumination that had transformed the modest church into something ancient and sacred. I remained seated in the front pew, my hands gripping the worn wood with white knuckles as if it could anchor me to some sense of normalcy in a world that had just revealed itself to be far stranger and more mysterious than I had ever imagined. My heart was still racing from what I had witnessed, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum announcing the arrival of something momentous and life-changing. I found myself replaying those impossible moments over and over in my mind, examining each detail like a detective trying to solve a case that defied all conventional logic and scientific understanding. The perfect timing of the electrical failure, the simultaneous death and resurrection of every light in the building, the way the darkness had seemed to pulse with presence and intention, none of it made sense according to any rational understanding of how the physical world operated under normal circumstances. The silence that had initially greeted the return of the lights was beginning to fracture into whispered conversations, fragments of speculation and testimony floating through the church like incense. I could hear pieces of discussion from the pews behind me, elderly voices recounting decades of church attendance without ever witnessing anything comparable, younger voices struggling to reconcile what they had seen with their understanding of technology and natural law, children asking questions that their parents couldn't answer with any degree of confidence or certainty. Father Mackenzie stood at the altar, the unlit candles still arranged around him like sentinels bearing witness to what had transpired in this sacred space. He looked older somehow, as if the experience had aged him in those few minutes of darkness, adding weight to his shoulders and lines to his face that hadn't been there during the regular portions of the memorial service. His silver hair seemed to catch the restored artificial light differently now, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gravity that seemed to acknowledge the profound nature of what we had all shared together in this small sanctuary. "I think," he said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of a man who understood that his next sentences would be remembered, discussed, and analyzed for years to come by everyone present, "that we have all been witness to something extraordinary today. Something that challenges our assumptions about the nature of reality and the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of his congregation before finding mine across the small sanctuary. In his gaze, I saw a mixture of wonder and uncertainty that mirrored my own internal struggle between skepticism and belief. Whether we choose to interpret what happened as electrical malfunction or divine intervention is ultimately a matter of personal faith and individual understanding. But I believe with certainty that Margaret would be pleased to know that her memorial service will not soon be forgotten by anyone who is present here today. A few people chuckled softly at his words, but the laughter was different now, warmer, more reverent, touched with the kind of awe that comes from witnessing something that challenges fundamental assumptions about reality. Whatever initial skepticism had greeted the electrical event was gradually giving way to something else, something that acknowledged the profound timing and impossible coordination of what we had experienced together in this sacred space. Mrs. Henderson was the first to approach me, moving with the careful steps of someone whose arthritis had been acting up, but whose spirit remained undaunted by age or physical discomfort. Her weathered hand reached out to touch my shoulder with the gentle firmness of someone who had comforted countless people through decades of friendship and community involvement. Her fingers trembled slightly, whether from age, emotion, or the lingering effects of what we had witnessed, I couldn't tell. But her voice was steady and warm when she spoke. "Your mother," she said, her words barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the now quiet church, each syllable weighted with the accumulated wisdom of 8 decades of life. She never did like to miss the final word in any conversation. Lord knows I should remember that after 40 years of living next door to the woman. Her eyes were bright with tears, but also with something that looked remarkably like joy, as if the impossible event had confirmed something she had always hoped, but never dared to believe. 40 years I lived next to Margaret Sullivan, and she always had to have the last say about everything. What flowers to plant in our adjoining gardens, which contractor to hire for roof repairs, how to properly fold fitted sheets so they actually stayed neat in the linen closet, whether the mailman was dating that new girl at the post office. Why should death be any different from any other conversation she ever had? I stood and embraced her, this woman who had been like a second mother to me throughout my childhood, who had bandaged my scraped knees with the same tenderness she would have shown her own children, who had listened to my teenage complaints about homework and girls with patience that seemed inexhaustible. She smelled of lavender and old roses, the same perfume she'd worn to church every Sunday for as long as I could remember, a scent that instantly transported me back to summer afternoons spent in her garden while she and Mom discussed everything from local politics to the best recipes for preserving tomatoes from their abundant harvests. She loved you too, I told her, feeling the truth of it resonate in my chest like the echo of a cathedral bell. You were family to her, more than family. You were the sister she never had, the confidant who understood her stories about Dad's quirks and my teenage rebellions and all the small victories and defeats that make up a life lived in community. You know, Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice taking on the storytelling cadence that had entertained me as a child. Your mother called me 3 days before she passed. Just to chat, she said, but I think now she might have known something was coming. She talked about you for an hour, how proud she was of the man you'd become, how she worried you were working too hard and not taking time for the important things in life like family and friendship and simple pleasures. And then, right before she hung up, she said something that seemed odd at the time but makes perfect sense now. Mrs. Henderson paused, her eyes growing distant with memory. She said, "Helen, if anything ever happens to me, you make sure Michael knows that love doesn't end just because the heart stops beating. You tell him that some connections are stronger than death itself, stronger than anything this world can throw at us." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my knees go weak with the implications of what she was telling me. Had Mom somehow known that her time was running short? Had she sensed that death was approaching and wanted to prepare me for what lay ahead? To provide comfort and reassurance that would only make sense after she was gone? Dr. Phillips approached us next, his usually confident demeanor replaced by an expression of deep bewilderment that spoke to a man whose worldview had just been fundamentally challenged by evidence that didn't fit any known scientific framework. He had always been the voice of medical reason in our small community, the one people turned to for rational explanations of life's mysteries, and the reassuring certainty that science could provide answers to most questions that arose in daily life. "Michael," he said, his voice carrying an unusual hesitancy that I had never heard before in all my years of knowing him, "I need you to understand something. I've been thinking about what happened here today, going over it again and again in my mind, and I cannot explain it. Not medically, not scientifically, not through any framework I've learned in 30 years of practicing medicine, or the additional years I spent studying electrical engineering before switching to healthcare." He shook his head slowly, as if still trying to process the impossibility of what he had witnessed firsthand. The timing of the electrical failure, the perfect coordination of every system in this building, the way every light responded as a single unit, it defies everything I understand about how power grids work, how circuits function, how electricity behaves under normal circumstances. He gestured toward the ceiling fixtures, which continued to burn with steady, unremarkable illumination. "I helped with the electrical inspection when this church was rewired 5 years ago as part of the renovation project your mother helped coordinate. I know this system intimately. It's modern, properly installed, with multiple circuit breakers and safety redundancies designed to prevent exactly the kind of coordinated failure we witness today. For every light to die simultaneously would require a catastrophic surge that would have damaged the fixtures themselves, blown fuses, triggered emergency shutoffs throughout the building. Dr. Phillips reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device I recognized as a multimeter, the kind electricians use to test voltage and current in electrical systems. I brought this from my car after the service ended. Old habits from my engineering days, I suppose. I tested the main electrical panel while everyone was talking and processing what had happened. Everything is functioning perfectly. Voltage is steady, amperage is normal, no signs of power fluctuations or system stress anywhere in the building. Whatever caused that coordinated electrical event left absolutely no trace in the system itself. Tom Brennan joined our growing circle, his weathered face creasing with genuine warmth as he shared his own interpretation of the morning's events. "I've been thinking about what your mother always used to say about the church lights," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly in the quiet sanctuary. "Remember how she was always the first one here for early morning meetings and committee work? She'd unlock the building and turn on all the lights, and she used to joke that she was waking up the church for the day, bringing it to life for whatever activities were planned." He smiled at the memory, his expression reflecting decades of shared community experiences. "Margaret always said that lights weren't just about illumination, they were about welcome, about making people feel safe and included and valued. Today, I think she found a way to control those lights one more time, to make sure we all paid attention to her final message of love and connection." The Miller family approached as a unit, but it was their teenage daughter Sarah who spoke with the most unexpected conviction, her young voice cutting through the adult conversations with startling clarity and insight that seemed remarkable for someone her age. "I need to tell you something," she said, looking directly at me with an intensity that commanded attention. "During those minutes when the lights were out, when everyone was talking and trying to figure out what was happening, I felt something. Someone else in the church with us." She paused, searching for words to describe an experience that clearly challenged her usual vocabulary. It wasn't scary or threatening or anything like that. It was more like having a grandmother you'd never met come to visit, but somehow knowing exactly who she was the moment she walked through the door. Sarah continued with growing confidence, apparently unconcerned about adult skepticism. "I know how that sounds. And I know most adults think teenagers just make stuff up for attention or because we're dramatic. But this was real. More real than anything I've ever experienced. During those dark minutes, I felt surrounded by love. Not the kind you get from your parents when they're trying to make you feel better about something, but deeper than that. Older than that. Like being wrapped in a blanket that had been keeping people warm for generations." She turned to face the altar where the candles had burned during those mysterious minutes. "And there was something else. I heard humming, just for a few seconds. So quiet I almost thought I was imagining it. It was an old song, something my great-grandmother used to sing when I was little and stayed overnight at her house. I haven't heard it in years, but I recognized it immediately." Sarah looked back at me with an expression that seemed far older than her 16 years. Mrs. Sullivan was saying goodbye, but she was also saying hello. She was letting us know that she was okay, that she was still connected to all of us, that love really doesn't end when someone dies. "Does that make sense to you?" I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. It made perfect sense, more sense than any electrical explanation could possibly provide. But it was old Mrs. Patterson who provided the most compelling testimony of all. At 83, she had attended St. Mary's longer than anyone present, a living repository of church history, who had witnessed the building through multiple renovations, power outages, natural disasters, and every conceivable kind of mechanical failure that could befall an aging structure. "In all my years," she said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her advanced age, "I've seen this church through everything you can possibly imagine. Tornadoes, ice storms, power failures, equipment breakdowns of every description. What happened today was different. Those lights didn't fail. They were turned off, deliberately, purposefully, with perfect timing that no electrical malfunction could achieve. and then they were turned back on the same way. She reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out a small address book with pages yellowed by age. With shaking hands, she flipped to a familiar entry. Your mother's phone number. I've been meaning to cross it out since the funeral, but I keep forgetting. She tore out the page and pressed it into my palm. After today, I understand why. Some connections don't end just because the phone isn't answered anymore. Father Mackenzie joined our circle, carrying an air of quiet contemplation. Michael, he said gently, I hope you'll find comfort in what happened here today. Your mother was a woman of deep faith who believed that love was stronger than death, that connections transcend physical existence. Perhaps today, she found a way to demonstrate that belief in terms we could all witness and understand. As the congregation departed, I found myself alone with Father Mackenzie. Walking to the altar, I asked, Do you really believe it was her? He was quiet before responding. I believe that love creates connections transcending our understanding of physical reality. Your mother's love for you didn't end when her heart stopped beating. That love is a force in the world, and forces find ways to make themselves known. Standing where the candles had flickered, I felt acceptance settle in my chest. Walking into the October air, I felt fundamentally changed. I love you too, Mom, I said aloud. I promise I'll live a life that would make you proud. A gentle wind stirred the leaves, and for a moment I smelled lavender and apple pie. Driving away, I carried renewed understanding. Some loves are too powerful to be extinguished by death. The lights had gone out and returned, but the light my mother kindled in my heart would burn forever.